She was the woman no one looked at twice, until the most dangerous man in Chicago couldn't look away. Maren Holloway spent years shrinking herself to survive in rooms that were never built for her, mocked for her size, ignored for her brilliance, erased by the very men whose books she kept clean. But when a crime lord walks through the doors of Blackthorn Capital, demanding answers for missing millions, and every executive in that building loses their nerve, Maren doesn't flinch. She speaks. And nothing is ever the same again. If you've ever been underestimated by people who weren't half as smart as you, this story is for you. Watch until the end, and drop a like, then comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain started just before 7 in the morning, the kind of hard, sideways Chicago rain that gets into your collar no matter how well you dress. It hammered the tall glass face of the Meridian Tower on South Wacker Drive and ran down in sheets, distorting the street below into a smeared watercolor of brake lights and black umbrellas. From the 34th floor, it looked almost beautiful. But Maren Holloway wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at the numbers. She had been looking at the numbers since 4:15 in the morning when something in column G of the Transcontinental Holdings ledger snagged in her mind like a fishhook. She'd pulled herself out of a half-sleep on her second-hand couch, brewed coffee she didn't bother to drink, and sat at her kitchen table in the dark with her laptop screen washing her face in white light. By 6, she had printed 47 pages of reconciliation reports. By 6:40, she was at her desk on the 34th floor, before the cleaning crew had finished, before the executives had arrived with their damp overcoats and practiced smiles. The number that snagged her was $4,312,000. It appeared 3 times across 3 separate subsidiary accounts. Same amount, same rounding. Same day of the month across a 6-month window, staggered through different holding structures with different registered agents in different jurisdictions. Delaware, the Cayman Islands, a shell registered in Malta she'd never seen referenced in any prior documentation. The transfers had been coded as licensing fees, all of them flowing into a single upstream entity simply titled TCV Holdings LLC. TCV Holdings LLC did not appear anywhere in Blackthorn Capital's official organizational chart. Maren pressed the end of her pen against her bottom lip and stared at the printed page until the ink went blurry. She was not a woman who jumped to conclusions. Conclusions required architecture. They required you to build the case from the foundation up, laying each verified fact like brick, not leaping across gaps because the gap looked jumpable. She'd learned that the hard way early in her career when she'd flagged an account discrepancy at a small regional firm and been told, loudly and in front of colleagues, that she had misread a standard intercompany transfer and wasted everyone's time. She had not misread it. The partner who corrected her had gone to prison 4 years later. But that memory sat somewhere behind her sternum like a small bruise, and it still made her careful, methodical, patient in a way that people sometimes mistook for slowness. She wasn't slow. She was precise. She spread the printouts across her desk and began mapping the flow manually, old school, with a pencil and a yellow legal pad. Income from Blackthorn's publicly reported real estate and consulting revenues moved in one direction. But there was a parallel current buried inside 6 different subsidiary structures, accounts that showed legitimate enough activity on the surface, regular payroll outflows, vendor payments, quarterly tax provisions, and then, tucked into the seams of those structures, the transfers, small enough individually to stay below automated flagging thresholds, consistent enough that when you plotted them on a calendar, they formed a rhythm, a heartbeat. 18 months of this. Conservative estimate, $46 million, possibly more if there were structures she hadn't found yet. Maren set her pencil down. She picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. $46 million. The office began to fill around her. She heard the elevator chime, heard the particular cough and shuffle of Derek Paulson arriving 20 minutes late as usual, heard Cassandra from billing laughing at something on her phone before she'd even sat down. No one acknowledged Maren. No one ever did, particularly in the morning, particularly when they came in and found her already at her desk surrounded by paper, because that image, Maren hunched over printouts before anyone else had arrived, was so routine as to be invisible. That was the word. Invisible. She had been at Blackthorn Capital for 4 years, and she remained, to most of the people on this floor, a background element, a piece of functional office furniture. The forensic auditor who sat in the corner office that wasn't really a corner office, just the desk wedged beside the supply closet where the overhead light flickered. And no one had fixed it in 8 months because no one felt particularly motivated to fix the light above Maren Holloway's head. She was 31 years old and she was good at her job in the way that a structural beam is good at holding weight. Essential, load-bearing, and almost entirely unconsidered until something goes catastrophically wrong. She'd applied to 4 other firms over the past 18 months. 2 hadn't called back. 1 had brought her to a second interview and then gone silent. The 4th had offered her a position at a 16% pay cut and framed it as an opportunity. So she stayed. She stayed and she worked and she kept her head down and she saw things, because invisible people always do. They see the looks that pass between executives in meetings. They see which junior analysts are sleeping with which senior partners. They see who fudges their expense reports and who's been taking client meetings without logging them in the CRM. Maren saw all of it, cataloged it in the methodical filing cabinet of her mind, and kept her mouth shut, until the numbers became impossible to ignore. She was still staring at the legal pad when the elevator chimed again at 9:17 and the entire energy of the floor shifted. She felt it before she understood it, a change in air pressure almost, like the moment before a storm breaks. The background noise of the office dropped not all at once but in ripples, conversation dying first nearest the elevator and spreading outward. She heard heels clicking fast across hardwood, heard Paulson say something and then immediately say nothing, heard the particular quality of silence that falls over a room when someone enters it who frightens people. Maren looked up. The man who walked onto the 34th floor of Blackthorn Capital was not physically extraordinary, which was somehow the most unsettling thing about him. He was perhaps 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maren's monthly rent. Dark hair, close-cropped, a face that was handsome in a compressed, controlled way, the kind of face that had learned to give nothing away. He walked like someone who had spent years deciding whether every room he entered was worth his time. Behind him came 2 men in identical dark coats who positioned themselves at the elevator doors without being told. Behind them came a 3rd man in a gray suit, younger, carrying a leather document portfolio, and looking at his phone with the practiced calm of someone who'd learned that projecting calm was part of his job. Maren knew who the man in the charcoal suit was. Everyone in Chicago's financial district knew who Dominic Viscari was. In the same way, everyone knew which neighborhoods you didn't drive through at night and which building permits got approved without normal process. You knew it the way you knew about weather systems, not because you tracked them yourself, but because the atmosphere changed around them. Dominic Viscari was the head of the Viscari Syndicate, which was what polite circles called it. The organizations he controlled touched real estate development across 6 Midwest cities, private logistics networks, 3 separate legitimate holding companies, and Schulk, according to things spoken only in careful voices, the distribution infrastructure for half the gray market commerce moving through the port of Chicago. He was also, on paper, Blackthorn Capital's largest single client. He was also the man whose accounts Maren had spent the last 5 hours discovering were being systematically drained by someone inside this building. Randall Fitch, Blackthorn's managing partner, appeared from his corner office, moving at a speed Maren had never seen him achieve in 4 years. Randall was 62, silver-haired, and relentlessly patrician in the way of men who'd grown up with money and cultivated the accent and posture to remind everyone of it. Right now, he looked like a man who had sat on something sharp. "Dominic," Randall said, extending his hand, "we weren't expecting." "I know you weren't." Viscari's voice was low, not loud. He didn't need loud. That was the point. Randall's hand hung in the air for a moment before Viscari shook it, briefly, the way you shake hands with someone when the handshake is a formality and both parties understand it. "Of course. Let's use the conference room. We can get everyone—" "I spoke to your head of finance last week," Viscari said. "I sent documentation to your senior audit team the week before that. I've been told the discrepancy is under review." He paused. "I want to know what that means." The conference room they moved into had glass walls, which meant Maren could see the meeting without hearing it. She watched Randall take the head of the table, which was a mistake. Viscari sat where Viscari chose to sit, and he chose the chair that put his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, and that put Randall in the seat to his left like a subordinate. She watched the other senior partners file in. Carter Drummond, head of structured products, who was 6'4" and had played college football and still moved like someone who expected rooms to accommodate him. Lena Price, managing director of client relations, who was extremely competent and also extremely good at making her competence invisible behind very expensive social polish. 4 others, all senior, all the kind of people who attended the right events and belonged to the right clubs and had their names on things. None of them, Maren understood in the particular cold way of someone watching carefully, had any idea what was actually happening inside their own firm's accounts, which meant whoever had run this scheme was very good and very careful and very much still here. Her phone buzzed. A calendar reminder, quarterly billing summary, due to Randall's office by noon. She dismissed it without looking away from the conference room. Inside, the dynamic had shifted in a way that was readable even through glass. Randall was talking, gesturing, the performance of a man projecting controlled authority. Vascari was not reacting. That stillness, Maren had seen it in people before, the kind of stillness that wasn't passivity but calculation. It meant he had come here already knowing the answers wouldn't satisfy him. She looked back at her legal pad. $46 million. TCV Holdings LLC. 6 months of transfers, a holding structure that appeared in none of Blackthorn's disclosed organizational documentation. Her hand moved before she made a decision, the pencil tracing a connection she'd noticed 20 minutes ago, but not yet followed. The registered agent address for TCV Holdings LLC in Delaware was the same address used for a different entity she'd seen in passing while running a parallel search 2 weeks ago on a separate client matter. She hadn't flagged it then because at the time it looked like standard shared agent administrative overlap, the kind that happened all the time in corporate structures where attorneys use the same filing service for multiple clients. She wrote the second entity name on the legal pad, Drummond Holdings Advisory Group LLC, Carter. Drummond. Her pencil stopped. She sat with that for exactly 30 seconds. Let the implications arrange themselves with the same methodical patience she applied to everything. Then she reached for her keyboard and began pulling every document she could access that referenced Carter Drummond's client accounts, his internal authorizations, his expense sign-offs, his electronic access logs to Blackthorn's financial management systems. The data was ugly. Not because it was obviously fraudulent, it wasn't. That was the genius of it. It was structured to look like standard executive-level authorization, reasonable approval amounts, routine descriptions, codes that matched existing vendor categories. But when you plotted it against the timing of Vascari's missing funds and overlaid Carter's system access logs, late-night logins, weekend activity, access to subsidiary account structures that had no legitimate reason to fall within his operational authority, the architecture became visible. Carter Drummond had built himself a very sophisticated drain. Maren was still pulling documents at 11:40 when the conference room doors opened. The meeting had not gone well. She could tell by the posture of the men filing out, the way Randall's silver hair seemed to have lost some of its certainty, the way Lena Price moved toward her office with the clipped efficiency of someone who needed to make phone calls she didn't want overheard. Carter Drummond walked out of the conference room laughing at something, a short bark of sound that didn't reach his eyes, and Maren watched him cross the floor toward his office and thought about the $46 million and the Delaware registration and the late-night logins. Then she looked up and found Dominic Vascari standing still in the middle of the floor, his 2 men flanking him at a distance, and his eyes pointed directly at her. Not at the conference room he'd just left. Not at Randall, who was still attempting some final diplomatic word behind him. At her. He wasn't looking at her the way the partners looked at her. Through her, past her, the visual equivalent of walking around a piece of furniture. He was actually looking, the way you look at something that doesn't fit the pattern, something that registers. Maren did not look away. This was perhaps the most surprising thing she'd done in her 4 years at Blackthorn Capital. Most interactions with powerful men in this building ended with her eyes dropping to her desk. Not from fear, exactly. More from the bone-deep social conditioning of a woman who'd learned that holding eye contact in certain rooms was interpreted as challenge, and challenge invited attention. And attention from the men in this building was never the kind that served her. But she held it. Maybe because she was tired. Maybe because she had $46 million of evidence spread across her desk and her entire nervous system was operating on a frequency that had temporarily overridden the usual careful self-erasure. Viscari held her gaze for 3 seconds. 4. His expression didn't change. Then he turned and said something to his third man, the one with the portfolio, and continued toward the elevator. Maren exhaled through her nose and looked back at her screen. At 12:10, while most of the senior staff was at lunch, her desk phone rang. It was Randall. "Holloway, my office." She gathered nothing. Went as she was, in the plain charcoal blazer she'd worn for 3 Tuesdays running because she'd never found a reason to spend money on clothes when the people who would see her wouldn't register them anyway. Randall's office faced the lakefront. On clear days, you could see Michigan's blue flat distance out his windows. Today it was gray water and gray sky, and somewhere in that gray, a cargo freighter moving south. He didn't offer her a seat. "I need the Transcontinental Review finalized by end of week," he said, not looking up from whatever was on his desk. "There's a problem with Transcontinental." Now he looked up. What kind of problem? She had 2 options. She'd known, from the moment she picked up her pencil at 4:15 this morning, that eventually she would arrive at this moment, and she'd known that the moment would split into 2 paths. Option 1 was the path she'd always taken. She could frame it carefully, build the caveat architecture, suggest a formal internal review, give Randall room to manage the problem through channels that would allow him to manage it in ways that served the firm and its relationships, and specifically its relationship with Blackthorn's largest client. She could be professional, careful, deniable. Option 2 was the truth. $46 million has been transferred out of Viscari-connected accounts over the past 18 months through a shell entity called TCV Holdings LLC, she said. The entity is directly linked through shared registration to a holding company controlled by Carter Drummond. The transfer pattern is consistent, systematic, and structured specifically to avoid automated flagging. I have documentation. Randall's face did something complicated. The sequence of it was surprise, then rapid calculation, then something that might have been anger or might have been fear, and then, finally, the very particular expression of a man who is deciding how to handle a problem in a way that protects him. That's a serious allegation, Maren. It's not an allegation, it's a documented analysis. You ran this yourself? I did. Without being assigned to it. The discrepancy came up in routine review. I followed the data. He set his pen down. "I'm going to need you to hold off on anything further until I've had a chance to review your findings personally, and I would strongly advise you not to discuss this with anyone on the floor." The subtext was not subtle. The subtext was, "I am going to bury this, I'm going to decide what gets surfaced and to whom, and the firm's interest in managing its largest client relationship is going to weigh heavily in that calculation. And your job depends on your understanding of these priorities." Maren thought about this. She thought about Carter Drummond laughing in the hallway. She said, "Viscari is still in the building." Randall's expression sharpened. "What? I saw his car in the garage from the window 20 minutes ago. He didn't leave." This was a guess, actually. She'd seen a black Suburban still positioned on the lower level, which could have been his or could have been anyone's, but she'd watched Viscari's eyes on the way out, and there was something in them that said this meeting had not given him what he came for, and he wasn't a man accustomed to not getting what he came for. Randall stood up, sat back down. This was a man unaccustomed to having no good options, which was when the conference room door opened again. She heard it from where she stood in Randall's office, and she saw Randall look past her shoulder at the glass, and the expression on his face completed her sentence for her. She turned. Viscari had come back. He was standing in the main floor space again, his men behind him, and this time he wasn't making his way toward any office or toward any executive. He was looking at the floor in the particular way of a man who has decided he's done with intermediaries. His gaze swept the space and landed on her, standing in the frame of Randall's office doorway. He didn't look away this time either. He crossed the floor toward her with the quiet directness of a man who had never in his adult life had to work hard to get where he was going. Randall appeared at Maren's shoulder, positioning himself. Whether to intercede or to hide, she wasn't entirely sure. "Mr. Viscari," Randall began. "You." Viscari was looking at Maren. "You were watching that meeting." It wasn't a question. She wasn't going to treat it like one. "Yes. The whole time." Yes. Something shifted in his face, fractional. Why? Randall made a sound beside her, something between an intervention and a warning. Maren felt the weight of the decision the way you feel the edge of a diving board under your feet, the solid surface ending, the air beginning. Because I found something this morning that explains why your meeting didn't give you answers, she said. The floor had gone quiet in that particular way again. She was aware of it. The stopped keyboards, the not turning heads that were definitely listening, the specific quality of held breath that fills a room when something that can't be undone is about to happen. Viscari studied her face. She had no idea what he found there. She was not a woman who'd spent much time learning to perform for an audience. "Show me," he said. Randall said, "I don't think this is the appropriate—" "I wasn't talking to you." Viscari still hadn't looked at Randall. "I was talking to her." Maren turned and walked back to her desk. She was aware of the silence tracking her, aware of feet shifting and chairs swiveling and the expensive sound of Viscari's shoes on the hardwood floor behind her. She sat down, pulled her legal pad front and center, and spread the printouts in the order she'd arranged them. The base ledger anomalies, the TCV holding structure, the comparative access log analysis, the registration linkage. Viscari stood over her desk. His third man, the one with the portfolio, positioned himself to the left. Randall hovered behind them both, uselessly. She walked through it, methodically. She did not frame it as allegation or possibility. She presented the architecture the way she had built it: fact, connection, evidence, conclusion. She used her pencil to trace the flow on the printed pages, the way one number pointed to another, the way the timing aligned, the way the shell structure had been deliberately designed to look mundane. When she got to the registration linkage between TCV Holdings and Drummond Holdings Advisory Group, she heard something from the vicinity of Carter Drummond's office, a chair scraping. She finished the analysis without looking up. Silence. Then Viscari said quietly, "Where is Drummond?" Randall said, "Now, let's be clear that this requires further internal verification before—" "Where is he?" Carter Drummond's office was visible through a glass partition 12 feet away. The chair behind his desk was empty. The door to the back corridor that connected to the service elevator was standing open at an angle that suggested it had been moved in the last 3 minutes. One of Viscari's men was already moving toward it. Viscari looked down at Maren's desk, at the 47 pages and the legal pad and the hand-drawn diagram that had taken her 7 hours in the dark. He picked up the legal pad. "Read it. Set it down." He looked at her directly. Not at her work. At her. "How long have you been at this firm?" 4 years? Same desk the whole time? It was a strange question. Yes. His eyes moved to the overhead light, the one that flickered, then back to her. "What do you want?" Another strange question. Also, somehow, the most disorienting one she'd been asked in recent memory, which was saying something. "I want to know who signed off on the Malta registration," she said, because it was true. And because it was the one piece she hadn't traced yet. Something happened in his expression that was not quite a smile. Close to it. Not warm, exactly. More like the recognition of a species he hadn't expected to find here. "Come with me." Randall made a noise. Viscari turned to look at him for the first time in several minutes. "Your firm has a problem," he said. "She found it. I'm going to deal with it." He picked up the organized stack of Maren's printouts from her desk, which was perhaps the most presumptuous thing anyone had ever done in her presence. "Send me whatever else is in your system. I'll have someone provide you a secure upload path." He was talking to her again, not Randall. Randall had effectively ceased to exist in the architecture of this conversation. Maren stood up. She did not know, in that moment, whether this was the best decision of her life or the worst. She understood, with the same methodical clarity that she applied to financial structures, that she was choosing to step off the edge of the particular life she'd been living, the invisible life, the careful life, the life of the flickering light and the desk by the supply closet and the meetings where she was furniture, and onto a different surface entirely. She had no clear view of what that surface was. She picked up her laptop and her access badge and her cold coffee and left the cup on the desk when she thought about it. She wouldn't need it. She walked across the 34th floor for the last time in a specific way. Not the way she'd walked it every other day, shrunk into the margins, calibrated to take up minimum space, but straight across the center behind Dominic Viscari, while the entire floor watched and not one person said anything. Carter Drummond, she would later learn, made it to the service elevator and the parking structure before Viscari's men found him in a stairwell 2 floors below with his phone battery dead and his car keys in his hand and $46 million in an account he would never touch again. The elevator closed on the 34th floor. The rain was still coming down on the glass tower on South Walker Drive. Maren stood in the elevator beside a man she did not know, heading toward a destination she had not been told, carrying nothing but her work and whatever it was she'd always been underneath the invisibility. When the elevator reached the lobby and the doors parted on the gray Chicago morning, Viscari spoke without turning toward her. "The Malta registration," he said. "It was signed by one of my own people." The lobby doors slid open ahead of them. Cold air and the smell of rain came through. "Which one?" she said. His jaw tightened, fractional, the only crack in the controlled surface she'd seen so far. "That's what I need you to find out." The black Suburban was waiting at the curb, rain sheeting off its roof. One of his men pulled the door. Viscari stepped toward it, and Maren understood, with absolute certainty, that this was the real edge. Not the conversation with Randall, not the walk across the floor. This. The door was open. The rain came down. The city moved around them, indifferent and gray and continuous. She got in. Jet. The lakefront estate appeared through the rain like something from a different category of existence. The Suburban came off Lakeshore Drive and through a gate that opened before the vehicle slowed, down a private lane lined with oaks that were old enough to have roots the width of a person. And then the house itself appeared at the end of it, 4 stories of stone and dark glass, built into a low bluff above the lake, surrounded by carefully maintained grounds that looked, in the February rain, like something between a park and a fortress. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like cedar and something Maren couldn't immediately identify. Old paper, maybe, and coffee, and the particular smell of a space that had been lived in by someone who didn't entertain much. She was brought to a room on the 2nd floor. Not a guest room, an office. A working office, with 2 monitors, a drafting table along one wall covered in maps and printed documents, and bookshelves that held actual books and not decorative ones. She could tell because the spines were cracked, and there were loose pages stuffed between volumes, and some of them had been turned face out to mark pages. The man who showed her in, the young one with the portfolio, whose name she still didn't know, set her laptop bag on the desk and said, "He'll be in shortly. You can connect to the secure network. Password on the card." He left a card with a handwritten password and closed the door. Maren stood in the room alone for a moment. She looked at the maps on the drafting table. They were city maps, several cities, with handwritten annotations in a cramped script she couldn't read from where she stood. She looked at the bookshelves. Finance, history, several volumes on urban development, one on forensic accounting that she'd read herself 3 years ago. The spine was cracked the way a book gets when you've opened it past 100 times. She set up her laptop. It took her 40 minutes to reconstruct her analysis on the secure system, pulling in the documentation she'd remotely transmitted from Blackthorn's servers before she'd packed her bag. She was in the middle of cross-referencing the Malta entity against a database of known shell networks when the door opened. Viscari had changed out of the charcoal suit. He was wearing a dark shirt, collar open, no jacket. He looked less like a man who had walked into a financial firm and more like a man in his own house, which he was, and the difference was visible in the set of his shoulders, marginally less constructed. He sat in the chair across the desk from her. It was clearly his chair, his desk, without apparent ceremony about the fact that she'd set her computer up in his space. "Show me where you are," he said. She showed him. It took an hour. He asked questions, specific ones, which told her that the financial documentation she was working through wasn't alien to him. He understood the structures, knew the terminology, had clearly spent time in rooms where these things were discussed. He didn't pretend otherwise, and she didn't condescend. It was, in a strange way, the most functional working interaction she'd had at a desk in years. When she got to the Malta registration and the layers of ownership she'd mapped between TCV Holdings and the syndicate's legitimate holding companies, she set her pencil down. "The signature on the registration documents is a proxy," she said. "It goes through 2 layers of nominee directors before it connects to any real person. But the authorization trail inside your internal accounts is cleaner. Someone with direct system access initiated the transfer structure. That level of access is limited. She had a list. She didn't show it yet. Viscari leaned forward. In the lamplight of the office, he looked more tired than he had on the 34th floor. Not weak, tired in the way of someone carrying a weight that doesn't get set down. How many people are on the list? 7 with sufficient access. I can get it to 5 if I rule out 2 whose access logs show no activity during the relevant windows. 5. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the windows, the lake was invisible in the dark and the rain, just a sound, the continuous low push of water against the bluff. One of them is Victor Serrano, he said. Not a question. A statement delivered to the middle of the room, like a thing being set down carefully. Maren looked at him. You knew. I suspected. He picked up a pen from the desk, turned it in his fingers, set it back. Victor has been my second for 11 years. He knows where everything is. Every structure, every account, every relationship. He paused. Which means if it's him, the missing money isn't the problem. The missing money is the distraction. The clarity of that landed in her chest like something cold. He was right. A man who had been in Viscari's organization for 11 years, who had sufficient access and sufficient intelligence to construct this scheme. He wasn't stealing $46 million because he needed $46 million. He was building something. He was capitalizing something. You need me to trace where it went, she said, not just where it came from. I need to know who he's paying, Viscari said, and what they're building with it. The wind pressed against the windows. The rain came down harder, rattling the glass. Maren looked at her screen, at the layered structure of shell entities and offshore accounts and transfer histories that now, reframed, looked less like a theft and more like a blueprint. That's going to take time, she said. How much? Depends on how deep it goes. Days at minimum, possibly weeks. He nodded once. You'll stay here. It wasn't a question. It also wasn't quite the command it might have sounded like, because underneath it there was something she didn't expect. Something that sounded, fractionally, like he was telling her she would be safe here, which was strange, because she hadn't been thinking about safe. She'd been thinking about the data. She looked around the office, at the cracked spine books and the city maps with their cramped annotations, and the 2 monitors and the window full of rain and dark water. I'll need access to your internal financial systems, she said. Full access, not read-only. Done. And I need to see the organizational chart for everyone with level 2 authorization on the holding accounts. Real one, not the version that gets sent to outside counsel. A very short pause. Done. And I need better coffee than whatever was in that car. The pause this time was different, shorter. And something shifted in his face, a fractional movement at the corner of his mouth that disappeared before it completed itself. Done, he said. She pulled her laptop toward her and opened a new document. Outside, the lake pushed against the bluff, and the rain came sideways off the water. And somewhere in the city behind them, in 11 years of institutional knowledge and a 7-figure trail of stolen capital, a man named Victor Serrano was building something that Dominic Viscari's empire would not survive unless she found it first. Maren began to type. She did not know yet that the files she was building would do more than save an empire. She did not know that someone inside the estate's walls was already watching her work and reporting to Victor Serrano, and that the clock on her safety had started the moment the Suburban turned off Lakeshore Drive. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew the numbers. And the numbers, if you followed them far enough, always led you somewhere true. The coffee arrived at 11:43 at night, which told her something about the house. Not a home where staff kept regular hours and went to their families at 6. A place that operated on a different clock entirely. A clock calibrated to threat and necessity, where people were awake because wakefulness was required, not because they chose it. The man who brought it was not someone she'd seen before. Mid-40s, thick through the neck, a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his jaw that had healed badly, the way scars do when they don't get proper attention. He set the tray on the edge of the desk without looking at her work, which either meant he'd been told not to look or he'd trained himself out of curiosity a long time ago. Mr. Viscari said you take it black. She did. She hadn't told anyone that today, which meant he'd noticed at the office when she drank the cold cup, which meant he'd been paying attention before she knew she was worth paying attention to. She filed that away. The coffee was good, genuinely good, Not the burnt-bottom institutional variety that lived in every office she'd ever worked in, but something with actual depth to it, the kind you got from beans that had been treated like they mattered. She drank half the cup standing up, feeling it move through the exhaustion like something mechanical being restarted. And then she sat back down and opened the organizational file Viscari had sent to the secure system 20 minutes ago. The real organizational chart. Not the filed version, the clean hierarchy with its registered titles and its compliance-friendly structure. The actual document, which looked like someone had tried to draw a nervous system from memory. Names connected by lines that indicated relationships more complex than reporting structures. Operational dependencies, financial authorities. Information access levels noted in a shorthand she spent 15 minutes decoding before it started to make sense. Victor Serrano appeared at the second tier, directly below Viscari. His access notations were marked in red, a color she suspected wasn't aesthetic. Level 2 financial authority, unrestricted. Operational authority across 3 of the syndicate's 6 primary business divisions. Personnel authority below director level. 11 years. She kept coming back to that number. You don't steal from someone you've worked beside for 11 years because you're greedy. Greed operates on a shorter timeline. 11 years of patience meant something different. It meant you were building toward a specific moment. It meant you had a plan that required time to architect, infrastructure to construct, relationships to cultivate outside the walls of the organization you intended to leave in ruins. She started a new tracking document and labeled it Destination of Funds. She was 3 layers into the offshore trail when she heard voices in the corridor outside. Not the low-volume operational murmur of a house at work. These were raised, controlled, still, in the way of men who'd learned that volume was a liability, but the specific register of control under pressure, the voice you use when you want to shout and can't let yourself. The voices moved, and then one of them stopped outside the office door. The door opened. Viscari came in first. Behind him, a step and a half back, the positioning of a man who was choosing to appear secondary but wasn't, came someone she hadn't seen before. Taller than Viscari by 2 inches, lighter in coloring, with the kind of angular face that photographs well and reads cold in person. He was wearing a jacket that was better quality than anything else she'd seen in this house tonight, which was interesting because this house was not lacking in quality. She knew who he was before anyone said his name, the same way she'd known things about structures all day. By pattern recognition, by the way the room reorganized itself around his presence, and specifically by the way Viscari's posture shifted when the man walked through the door behind him. Not deference. Something more complicated. The muscle memory of trust that was being actively interrogated. Victor Serrano looked at her. She looked back. "This is the auditor," Serrano said. Not a question, not an introduction, a categorization, delivered to Viscari but aimed at her. "Her name is Maren Holloway," Viscari said. "She's running the fund trace." "From here?" "Yes." Serrano moved into the room with the ease of someone for whom this space was familiar, which it presumably was. 11 years of second-in-command meant this house was as known to him as his own. He stopped at a distance from the desk that was calculated, she felt, to be close enough to read her screen without appearing to try. She angled the laptop 2 degrees. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to matter. His eyes moved to the angle change and then back to her face, and something registered in them. Not anger. Closer to interest, which was worse. "Randall Fitch called," Serrano said, turning back to Viscari. "He's concerned about the legal exposure of having an employee conduct unauthorized." "She's not his employee anymore," Viscari said. A beat. "Since when?" "Since this afternoon." Serrano absorbed this. His face didn't change in any way she could precisely identify, but the quality of the stillness shifted, the way water changes quality when something moves under the surface. "You hired her without a vetting process," he said, "without running her background, without consulting anyone about the security implications of bringing an outside person into this house and giving her access to—" "I hired her because she found in 7 hours what your finance team hasn't found in 18 months, Viscari said. The sentence landed flat and hard, the way a hand comes down on a table. "Tell me why that is, Victor." The room was very quiet. Serrano's jaw shifted fractionally. "Our team was working from incomplete data access, The shell structures were deliberately, she had the same data access. She had the same access, same systems, same documentation. She found it because she was looking, and your team wasn't. Viscari crossed to the window, turned his back to the room, and looked at the dark lake. So either your team is incompetent, which they're not, or they weren't looking for the right reasons. The sentence ended there. It didn't need elaboration. It sat in the room like an accusation that hadn't technically been made, and Serrano's response to it was to go very still, in the way of a man deciding between several options, none of which are good. That's an interesting inference, Serrano said carefully. It's not an inference, it's a question. Viscari turned from the window. Where has the money gone, Victor? The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Maren counted them. I don't know. You had access to every account it moved through. Dominic. The first name deployed carefully. I've been beside you for 11 years. You're going to stand in your own house and suggest... I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking you a question, and I'm waiting for an answer. Serrano straightened. He was good at this. The performance of dignity under accusation, the projection of a man who was offended rather than cornered. He'd clearly practiced it or had a talent for it that was close enough to practice that the difference didn't matter. I think the stress of this situation is leading you to look for a simple explanation, Serrano said. And this woman, the word carried a particular weight that made Maren's jaw tighten, came in here with a financial analysis that points in a convenient direction, and you're treating it as evidence. She has been in this house for... He checked his watch. Approximately 9 hours. You know me for 11 years. I think that warrants a different standard of... Leave, Viscari said. Serrano stopped. Tonight, I'll have someone... I'm not going to... I said leave. The 2 words. Quiet. Not loud. That quality again, the one she'd felt on the 34th floor, where the volume was low and the weight was total. Serrano looked at Viscari for a long moment. Then he looked at Maren. And this look was different from the first one. The first had been assessment. This one was something she filed under a different category entirely, a category that had to do with people who have decided to remember your face. He left. The door closed. Not slammed. Closed with precise, controlled quietness that was somehow more alarming than a slam would have been. Viscari stood with his back to her again. She waited. You heard all of that, he said. Yes. What did you make of it? She thought about how to answer this, not because she was uncertain of her analysis, but because she was aware that this was a man in a particular kind of pain, and precision mattered more than speed. He's very good, she said. The pivot to questioning my credibility was fast. The use of the 11-year relationship as a counterweight to evidence was calculated. He's done some version of this before, managed an accusation by reframing the accuser. Viscari turned from the window. In the lamplight, he looked older than he had on the floor of Blackthorn Capital, and she understood it wasn't the hour. It was the specific exhaustion of having a suspicion confirm that you had spent months willing yourself not to confirm. He is good, Viscari said. Quiet. Almost to himself. That's why I kept him. She didn't have anything useful to say to that, so she said nothing. He sat down in the chair across the desk, and it struck her that this was the second time tonight he'd done that. Taken the chair on the visitor's side, left her the position of relative authority at the desk, and she wasn't sure whether it was deliberate or simply the result of a man who was too tired to perform hierarchy. How long, he said, until you know where the money went? I have a partial trail already. 3 offshore jurisdictions, 2 of which route through entities that look like legitimate investment vehicles, but don't appear in any registry I can verify. The third one, she pulled up the screen, turned it so he could see, routes into a holding structure in Singapore. This one is recent. The last transfer was 11 days ago. He leaned forward and looked at the screen. She could feel the exhaustion coming off him, the specific density of a man running on will. 11 days ago, he said, which means it's active. Whoever is building with this money hasn't stopped building. What kind of structure needs that much capital input in Singapore? Infrastructure, she said. Logistics. The kind of capacity that supports moving things at volume. Could be legitimate on the surface, warehousing, freight forwarding, and used operationally for something else. He looked at her. You think he's building a distribution network? I think someone is building something that requires both financial infrastructure and physical infrastructure. And I think it's been in progress longer than 18 months, and the money from your accounts is the most recent capital injection, not the first. Vescari sat back. He pressed the knuckles of his right hand against his mouth and looked at the middle distance, and she watched him work through the implications with the same quality of attention she applied to her own analysis. Methodical, building from the foundation, not jumping to the conclusion before the structure could hold it. There's a rival organization, he said, the Corelli Network, out of Detroit. They've been trying to move into the Chicago market for 3 years. Every time they've pushed, they've hit resistance. Because your logistics infrastructure is already in place. Because nobody in this city moves product, any product, without going through channels I either own or have relationships with. That took 20 years. He paused. If Victor is building Corelli a parallel network, then when it's operational, you become optional, she said. He looked at her. And if you're optional, she continued, you're removable. The words sat between them. Outside, the rain had slowed to something thin and continuous, barely audible against the glass. The lake moved in the dark, patient and indifferent. When does it become operational? He said. I don't know yet. I need to trace the Singapore structure further, but the capital injection rate suggests they're in a final construction phase, not early stage. Weeks? Possibly. He stood up, moved to the bookshelves and stood looking at them without seeing them, his hands in his pockets. Then he said, without turning, Why are you doing this? She looked up. You walked out of your job this morning. You got in a car with a man you'd never met, came to a house you'd never seen, and you've been working in this room for 9 hours. Why? She considered the question with the same directness she'd applied to everything today. Because the problem was there, she said, and I'm the one who can solve it. He turned to look at her. That's it. And because nobody at Blackthorn was going to let me solve it, Randall was going to bury the analysis, and Carter Drummond was going to walk, and the $46 million was going to be a line item nobody discussed, and I was going to be the person who caused a problem instead of the person who found one. She paused. I'm tired of being erased. It came out more bluntly than she'd intended. She didn't take it back. Vescari looked at her for a long moment with that quality of seeing she still wasn't entirely comfortable with, the full attention look that felt like exposure rather than recognition, even when it wasn't hostile. Get some sleep, he said. 3 hours. There's a room on this floor. Marco will show you. I'm in the middle of the Singapore 3 hours, he said. You make mistakes when you're running on empty. I need you not to make mistakes. She wanted to argue. She had the argument constructed. She could run another 4 hours minimum before her error rate climbed. She'd done it before. She knew her own performance thresholds. But she looked at the screen and then at the legal pad and then at the number she'd circled twice in the last hour that she kept coming back to and not quite connecting. 3 hours. She saved everything to the encrypted drive and closed the laptop. The room Marco showed her to was plain and clean, a bed and a lamp and a window that faced the estate grounds rather than the lake. She lay down without changing her clothes, set a mental alarm with the disciplined reliability of someone who'd done it hundreds of times, and was asleep in 4 minutes. She dreamed about numbers, which was normal. In the dream, they were arranging themselves into a pattern she couldn't quite read, shifting every time she moved toward them. She woke at 3:12, 18 minutes before she'd intended, with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system has processed a threat signal during sleep. She lay still and listened to the house. The estate was never fully quiet. She'd understood that within the first hour here, there was always some level of ambient operational noise, the movement of people whose job was to be awake when others slept. But what she was hearing now was different. Somewhere on the floor below, a door had opened and closed with the speed of someone moving fast. And then there were footsteps. And then 2 voices in a register that carried through the house's stone walls as tension without carrying the words. She sat up, put her shoes on, opened her door. The corridor was empty, but the footsteps had gone toward the main staircase, and the voices were louder now. One of them she recognized as Vescari, lower, harder than it had been during their conversation, and the other, not Serrano, someone else, higher, younger. A voice with an edge of panic in it that it was trying to suppress. She moved to the top of the staircase and stopped. Below, in the main entry hall, Viscari stood in conversation with a young man she'd seen earlier stationed near the gate. The young man's left arm was wrapped in cloth. Not a proper bandage, cloth, improvised, and the cloth had taken on a dark, irregular stain that was spreading as she watched. 3 of them, the young man was saying. I didn't see the vehicle until they were already through the south perimeter. Karev was... He stopped, swallowed. Karev didn't make it. Maren gripped the banister. Viscari's back was to her. She couldn't see his face, but she could see his hands, and his hands were very still at his sides, which she'd learned in one day meant the opposite of stillness, meant a man containing a response that would otherwise be physical. Who? Viscari said. One word. We didn't get a positive ID, but the vehicle... The young man shifted, winced. It was a Corelli plate. We pulled it off the camera before they burned the South Outpost's feed. Corelli. Viscari turned and looked up the staircase and found her standing there, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Get dressed for outside, he said. I'm dressed. He looked at what she was wearing. The same charcoal blazer, the same dark trousers she'd put on at 6 this morning in a different life. Fine. He turned back to the young man and said 3 words she didn't catch, quiet and fast, and the young man moved toward the back of the house with the controlled urgency of someone who has learned to keep moving when hurt, because stopping means acknowledging how bad it is. She came down the stairs. Serrano contacted them, she said. Not a question. Within the hour of leaving this house, Viscari moved toward a panel in the wall beside the entry table, opened it. A recessed equipment space, rack-mounted monitors showing feeds from multiple cameras, and pulled up the south perimeter feed. Static. Then a 10-second preserved clip from before the feed died. The side of a black van moving fast through a tree line, no plates visible from this angle, and in the last 2 frames before the feed cut, the back doors of the van open and the silhouette of a man raising something long and dark. They weren't trying to breach the estate, Viscari said. This was a message. What message? He looked at the static where the feed had been. That he's already called them. That the timetable has changed. He closed the panel, turned to her with the look of a man who has revised his threat map in real time and didn't love what the revision showed. They'll hit the estate properly within 48 hours. You need to move. I need to do more than move. He picked up his phone from the entry table. I need to collapse their financial infrastructure before they can use it. Before whatever Serrano has been building becomes operational. He looked at her. How fast can you build the trap? What kind of trap? The kind that takes their money. She looked at him. He was not speaking metaphorically. If I can access their offshore structures, I'll give you access. I have system credentials from a cooperative account within their network. It's been dormant. It won't trip their monitoring, but it gives you a read pathway. A read pathway isn't enough to move money. No, he said, but it's enough to plant something that moves it when the right trigger fires. Can you do that? She thought about it. Not the ethics of it. The ethics were what they were. She was standing in a fortified estate at 3 in the morning watching a man bleed through improvised bandaging because someone had made a decision to destroy this house and everyone in it, and the ethics had reorganized themselves accordingly. She thought about the architecture of it, the technical requirements, the failure modes. The trigger would need to be something they activate themselves, she said. I can't reach into a live account without their security protocols flagging a foreign access. But if the trap is embedded and dormant and they walk into it, Monday morning, Viscari said, when financial markets open, they'll run their standard account reconciliation. Every network does it Monday morning. She looked at him. That's 60 hours, she said. I know. And between now and Monday morning, Serrano is outside these walls with a direct line to the Corelli network and a clear motivation to make sure I don't finish what I started. Yes. The entry hall was very quiet. Cold came through the stone walls in the specific way of structures built before insulation was a priority, a presence rather than an absence of warmth. I need full access to your system, she said. Everything, not the read-only partition I was working in. You have it. And I need someone to bring me whatever Serrano left behind in this house. His office, his personal files, anything he had access to in the last 30 days. I need to know exactly what he told them and when. Viscari nodded once, already reaching for his phone. She turned back toward the stairs, stopped, turned back. The man who was hurt. Marco will get him to a doctor. He said a man named Karev didn't make it. Veskari's face was very controlled. No. She held that for a second. A man who was not alive 3 hours ago, who had been alive when she arrived here. A man who had been shot and killed because the clock on this situation had moved without her realizing it was moving. 60 hours, she said. 59 now. She went back up the stairs and into the office and opened the laptop. The Singapore account was still on her screen, the cursor blinking in a half-finished query field. She looked at it. Then she looked at the encrypted credentials file Veskari had uploaded to the secure system in the 4 minutes she'd been standing at the staircase, and she looked at the dormant access pathway into the Corelli financial network that it represented, and she understood with absolute clarity that she had crossed a threshold that had no corresponding return path. She was not an auditor anymore. She was not the woman by the supply closet with the flickering light. She was something she didn't have a clean word for yet, something that lived in the space between the law she'd spent her career working inside and the specific, cold, operational logic of a war that had been declared in her direction, whether she'd chosen it or she had been working for 11 hours straight when the trap finished building itself. Not 11 hours of clean, uninterrupted work. 11 hours of the kind of concentrated effort that leaves marks on the body, the specific physical record of sustained focus, the ache across the base of her skull, the dryness behind her eyes that made the screen text blur at the edges every 20 minutes, the raw spot on her lower lip where she'd been pressing her pen without noticing. She'd drunk 4 cups of coffee and eaten half a plate of food that someone had left outside the office door at some point during the night without knocking, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated. The trap was elegant. She wasn't someone who used that word about her own work as a rule, but she looked at the architecture of what she'd built inside the Corelli network's dormant account pathway, and she thought, elegant. It was a layered trigger structure, invisible within the existing account reconciliation code, designed to activate when the network's Monday morning automated sweep ran its standard balance verification across 43 offshore subsidiary accounts. When the sweep fired, it would find the trigger. The trigger would execute a sequential transfer protocol that moved funds not out of the accounts directly, that would trip their security, but into a holding structure she'd built inside the accounts themselves, a shadow layer that would make the balances appear normal on their internal dashboards while the actual capital was being rerouted in the background through a series of nested transfers, each one staying under the automated flagging threshold, each one moving to a different jurisdiction, until the money was effectively dispersed across 17 accounts in 9 countries, none of which the Corelli network had any administrative access to. By the time their Monday reconciliation showed the discrepancy, the capital would be beyond recovery. Conservative estimate of what would move, $112 million. She sat back in the chair and looked at the screen. Outside the window, the grounds were gray with early morning, the kind of flat, colorless light that arrives before the sun commits. The rain had stopped somewhere around 4. The lake was visible now, dark slate, moving in long, low swells. She should have felt something. Relief, maybe? Or the particular satisfaction of a solved problem. Instead, she felt the exhaustion, and underneath it something she identified after a moment as unease. Not about the trap itself, about the silence. The estate had been operational all night. She'd heard movement, voices, the sound of vehicles on the gravel drive, the specific language of a house under elevated alert. But in the last 2 hours, the sounds had changed quality. Less movement, more stillness. The kind of stillness that was either the house settling into an exhausted quiet or the kind that preceded something. She saved everything to 3 separate encrypted locations, ejected the external drive, and put it in the inside pocket of her blazer. Then she went to find Veskari. He was in the ground floor room that functioned as a situation room, a space she'd walked past twice during the night without entering, visible through the doorway as a room with a long table, mounted monitors, and the sustained presence of people working. Now, at 6:40 in the morning, there were 4 people in it, and the quality of their attention when she appeared in the doorway told her something had happened. Veskari was at the far end of the table, standing, his jacket off and his sleeves pushed to the elbow in the way of someone who'd stopped caring about appearances several hours ago. He looked up when she came in. "It's done," she said. "The trap is in place. It fires Monday morning when their reconciliation sweep runs." No one said anything for a moment. "Sit down," Viscari said. The tone of it stopped her. Not the command. She'd gotten accustomed to his particular register of command, which was low and direct and didn't repeat itself. The tone underneath the command, the thing beneath the words that sounded like a man who was about to tell her something he didn't want to tell her. She sat. He moved to the chair across from her and sat too, and the four other people in the room suddenly found things to look at that weren't the two of them, which told her this was going to be a private conversation in a room full of witnesses. "We pulled Serrano's files," he said. "Everything he had access to on the estate systems. His communication logs, his personal files from the office on the third floor." And he put a folder on the table between them. Not a digital file. A physical folder, printed pages, and she understood from the physicality of it that someone had wanted her to hold the information rather than read it off a screen. She opened it. The first page was a communication log. Encrypted messages, decrypted by Viscari's technical team, time-stamped over the past 6 weeks. The correspondent was identified in the log as CV, Corelli, presumably, or someone within that network. The content of the messages was operational: updates on account activity, transfer timing, system access confirmation. She read through the first 3 pages with the methodical patience she applied to everything, and did not yet understand why Viscari's face looked the way it did. Then she turned to page 4. The message was dated 9 days ago. 3 days before she had found the discrepancy in Blackthorn Capital's transcontinental ledger. The message from CV to Serrano read, in the decrypted text, "Holloway is a problem. If she surfaces the account structure before Monday, contain her. Permanently, if necessary." She read the sentence twice. The words were not ambiguous. They were not open to interpretation. They were the specific language of a specific instruction delivered to a specific person 9 days before she had sat down at her kitchen table at 4:15 in the morning and noticed a number in column G that didn't belong. Her name. Her name was in Victor Serrano's communication log 9 days ago. She looked up from the page. "They knew about me," she said. "They knew you were running an independent audit review on the transcontinental structure," Viscari said. "Serrano had access to Blackthorn's internal scheduling system through a third-party relationship with one of your firm's IT vendors. He knew you'd been assigned routine review work on the Viscari-connected accounts. He didn't know how deep you'd go or how fast. But he knew I might find it. He knew it was a risk." She sat with this. The architecture of it assembled itself in her mind with the same speed and clarity as a financial structure, the connections snapping into place. Serrano had been monitoring the audit trail at Blackthorn Capital. He'd known for weeks that the account discrepancy was at risk of surfacing. He'd communicated that risk to the Corelli network, and the Corelli network's response 9 days ago had been to authorize her containment. She was already a target before she found the money. She was already a target before she walked into Randall's office, before she opened her mouth on the 34th floor, before she got into the Suburban. "How long has he known about me?" she said. Based on the logs, at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She had been sitting at her desk under the flickering light for 3 weeks, while Victor Serrano read updates about her audit activity and a criminal network in Detroit decided how much of a problem she represented. She had been invisible in the way she'd always been invisible, except to the people who'd had specific operational reasons to watch her. The cold feeling in her chest spread. "There's more," Viscari said. She looked at him. He reached across and turned to the next page in the folder. This one was a different log. Not communication, but system access. Time-stamped entries from the estate's own internal network. Access to the secure system she'd been working on all night. Her secure system. The entries were from a secondary access point she hadn't known existed. A shadow credential built into the estate's network architecture. Invisible to standard user monitoring. Accessible only to someone who had either built it or been given it by the person who had. The most recent entry was time-stamped 4 hours ago. 2:47 in the morning. While she was building the trap, someone had read everything she built. In real time. Every account number, every routing path, every element of the trigger structure she'd spent 11 hours constructing. The folder blurred slightly. She blinked it clear. "He read the trap," she said. "Yes. He knows every account I used, every routing path, every trigger element. Yes." Then it's useless. Her voice came out flat and precise, the voice she used when the flatness was holding something back. The moment Serrano read those files, he transmitted everything to the Corelli network. They'll have their technical people dismantle the trigger structure before Monday morning. They'll move the capital out of the accounts I targeted, restructure the offshore holdings, change the reconciliation parameters. Yes, Vescari said. She closed the folder. She set both hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at them and breathed through the specific sensation of 11 hours of work becoming worthless in the time it took to read 4 paragraphs. The sensation was not unfamiliar. She'd had audit work invalidated before, had data sets corrupted, had analysis overturned by new information. But this was different in kind. This wasn't a professional setback. This was the destruction of the only weapon she'd had. And somewhere outside these walls, Serrano was already on a phone with the Corelli network, and Monday morning was no longer a deadline in her favor. How did he get the shadow credential? She said. He built it. Vescari's voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger. The thing that lives underneath anger after anger has burned through its fuel. 11 years ago, when we migrated to the current network architecture, he built it as a redundancy measure, in case the primary systems went down. He paused. I approved it. She looked up. I approved a redundancy access credential for my second-in-command 11 years ago because it was operationally sound, he said. I forgot it existed. The sentence landed in the room. She thought about this quality of trust that operated on an 11-year timeline. The kind of trust that meant you approved things and filed them in the working memory of the institutional relationship and didn't audit them because you didn't audit the people you trusted, and that was what trust meant in practice, the cessation of verification. She thought about that, and she thought about Victor Serrano building a shadow credential 11 years ago and waiting. There's something else, Vescari said. She didn't move. He reached across and opened the folder to a page near the back. A financial document, account statement, single page, routing information at the top. She looked at the account number. She looked at it again. The routing number was from a bank in the Cayman Islands. The account name was a numbered company, but the secondary registration information at the bottom of the page, the beneficial ownership notation that appeared in certain jurisdictions as a disclosure requirement, listed an individual name as the account's authorized signatory. Maren Holloway. Her name, her actual legal name, spelled correctly, attached to an account in the Cayman Islands that she had never opened, had never known existed, and which showed a current balance of $4.3 million that had been deposited in 3 tranches over the past 6 weeks. The room did something she didn't have a rational word for, not spinning. More like a shift in the underlying reality of it, a sudden awareness that the floor she was standing on was not the floor she'd thought it was. Serrano built you a paper trail, Vescari said, before you found the money, before any of this. He built you a financial identity as a co-conspirator in the account drainage. If this goes to federal investigators, and he will make sure it does if the Monday trap fails, you're not the auditor who uncovered fraud. You're the fraudster. She heard herself breathe. 4.3 million, she said. 1/10 of what Drummond's structure moved. Enough to look like a fee. Like you flagged the discrepancy, not to expose it, but to redirect attention while you secured your payment and prepared to disappear. The architecture of it was perfect. She could see it with professional clarity and hated herself for the admiration, the involuntary recognition of a structure that was as well built as anything she'd ever analyzed. Serrano had constructed a parallel narrative for her. The forensic auditor who gets hired by a crime lord, who appears to uncover fraud, who turns out to have been the inside source all along, whose heroic presentation on the 34th floor was a performance designed to position herself inside Vescari's trust. If she ran, it confirmed it. If she stayed and failed, the paper trail remained. If the Monday trap was compromised and the Corelli network survived and Serrano walked free, he had the documentation to destroy her regardless of what else happened. He planned all of this, she said. Not a question. Before you ever walked into a building, Vescari said. She stood up. She needed to stand. The chair was pressing her into a posture of stillness that her body wouldn't maintain. She walked to the window. The grounds outside were coming into morning light, the oaks casting long, flat shadows across the wet grass. The gate at the far end of the drive closed and manned by 2 people she could see, and probably more she couldn't. She thought about the number in column G, the snagged fishhook feeling at 4:15 in the morning, the specific randomness of a detail catching in her mind on a night she'd worked late and gone home tired and fallen asleep on her couch instead of in her bed, where she might have slept deeper and not woken and not opened her laptop. The entire sequence of events had been set in motion by a random Tuesday night of insomnia. Serrano hadn't planned for that. He'd planned for the audit review to surface the discrepancy slowly, through proper channels, in a way he could monitor and manage. He hadn't planned for Maren to pull the thread at 4 in the morning and follow it 7 layers deep before anyone arrived at work, which meant the only edge she had was the one he hadn't anticipated: the speed, the depth. The fact that she'd gone further than the structured audit review would have taken anyone, faster than his monitoring timeline accounted for. She turned from the window. "I need to rebuild the trap," she said. "Different accounts, different routing architecture, different trigger mechanism." Vescari looked at her. "Everything he read last night gets abandoned. I build new structures he hasn't seen, accounts he can't anticipate because they don't exist yet." She came back to the table. "But I can't use your system. He has access to your system, and I can't build inside something he can read." "What do you need?" "A clean machine, air-gapped, nothing connected to your network. And I need access to a set of offshore accounts that Serrano has no knowledge of, accounts that didn't exist within your organizational structure before tonight, that aren't referenced in any documentation he's touched." Vescari was quiet for a moment. "I have 3 accounts in Luxembourg that were set up 8 months ago for a separate acquisition. Serrano wasn't involved in that transaction. He has no access and no knowledge." "Are they active?" "Dormant, waiting for the acquisition to close." "They're not dormant anymore." She picked up the folder and turned to the page with her name on it, looked at the account number one more time, set the folder down. "And I need a lawyer, someone outside your organization, someone Serrano has no connection to, who can begin constructing a documented counter-narrative to the paper trail before federal investigators receive whatever he's planning to send them." "I know someone. Tonight." "Tonight," he agreed. She pulled the encrypted drive from her blazer pocket and set it on the table. "Everything I built last night is on this. Account structures, routing paths, the full trigger architecture. All of it is now compromised. Serrano has it." She looked at Vescari. "I need you to transmit it." He looked at the drive. "To who?" "To Serrano," she said, "through a channel he monitors. Make him think the drive was recovered from my room during a security sweep, that I tried to destroy it and failed. That your people found it and you're holding it as leverage." Vescari's eyes moved to hers. "If he thinks the compromised trap is still the plan," she said, "he won't be looking for a second one." A long silence. Then something moved in Vescari's face. Not the fractional almost smile she'd seen twice now. Something deeper and more complicated. The expression of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew about the person in front of him. "You're going to let him think he's already won," Vescari said. "I'm going to let him think he's already won," she said. "And while he's telling the Corelli network that the threat is neutralized, I'm going to build something he cannot find because he will not be looking for it." She pulled out the legal pad. The same yellow legal pad she'd carried out of Blackthorn Capital's 34th floor, the one with the hand-drawn diagram that had started all of this. She turned to a clean page. "I need the Luxembourg account details," she said, "and I need the air-gapped machine. And I need someone to keep Serrano's attention on the compromised trap for the next 53 hours while I build the real one." Vescari reached for his phone. Outside, the morning light was getting stronger, burning the last of the gray out of the lake's surface. Somewhere in the city, in a network of accounts across 17 jurisdictions, a man named Victor Serrano was looking at the architecture of a trap he thought he'd already dismantled and feeling the particular satisfaction of a plan going exactly as designed. He did not know about Luxembourg. He did not know about the air-gapped machine. He did not know, could not know, because it hadn't existed 40 minutes ago, that Maren Holloway had already begun building the second version of something designed specifically for a man who thought he'd seen everything she. The air-gapped machine was a stripped laptop that Marco had pulled from a hard case storage unit in the basement. The kind of unit that existed in houses like this for operational contingencies that nobody named out loud. No network card, no wireless capability. A standalone processor with a clean operating system and nothing on it that connected to anything outside the room it was sitting in. Maren sat in front of it at a folding table in a room she hadn't been in before. A ground floor utility room, stone walls, no windows, a single overhead light that didn't flicker. Someone had brought in a second lamp. The Luxembourg account credentials were on a handwritten card to her left. The encrypted drive with the compromised trap was gone, transmitted through Vescari's channels to a monitored line that Serrano's network watched, carrying the message that the failed weapon had been recovered. She had 49 hours. She built without stopping. The new architecture was different in every way that mattered. Not just different accounts and different routing, but a different structural logic, designed not around the assumption that she had time and invisibility, but around the assumption that she had neither and needed the trap to be faster, simpler, and survivable if partially discovered. She stripped out the elegant layering she'd spent 11 hours on the night before. Elegance required time to build and time to execute. What she built now was brutal and direct. A single deep access trigger nested inside the Corelli network's primary reconciliation server, using a credential pathway she found inside the Luxembourg account's transaction history. A legacy authentication token from a shared banking platform that the Corelli network had used 3 years ago and never properly decommissioned. Old doors left unlocked. People did it constantly. They migrated to new systems and forgot to close the doors behind them because closing doors required knowing they existed. And knowing they existed required the kind of institutional audit discipline that criminal networks, whatever their operational sophistication, almost never maintained. She found the token at 2 in the afternoon on Saturday. She had the trigger planted by 6. Then she waited inside the architecture she'd built, watching it from the inside, looking for weaknesses, the way you look for load-bearing problems in a structure before you trust your weight to it. She found 2, fixed them. Found a third that wasn't a weakness, but an optimization opportunity. A secondary pathway that would accelerate the transfer sequence by 11 minutes, which in a financial intervention of this scale was the difference between completion and interception. She took the optimization. At 8:17 Saturday evening, she stood up from the folding table for the first time in 6 hours, and her knees nearly went. She caught herself on the edge of the table, waited for the blood pressure to normalize, and stood straight. Her lower back was a single sustained complaint. Her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sand. She drank the water someone had left on the floor beside her chair and didn't remember it arriving. She walked upstairs. The estate was in a different operational mode than it had been the previous night. Less movement, but higher tension. The specific quality of a house that has pulled its perimeter in and is waiting. 2 of Vescari's people were stationed in the main corridor. Both of them looked at her when she came up from the lower level, and neither said anything, which was the correct protocol, and also communicated, in the way that these things do, that the threat level outside the walls had not decreased. She found Vescari in the situation room. He was on the phone when she came in, and she heard enough before he registered her presence to understand the shape of the conversation. Logistics, timing, personnel. He was positioning people. Where and why she didn't need to know in detail. What she needed to know was the timeline. He ended the call. "The trap is rebuilt," she said. "It fires at market open Monday morning, 6:45 Central Time." "It's clean. It's clean. Serrano has nothing that connects to the new architecture. The Luxembourg credentials aren't in any documentation he's touched." Vescari set his phone on the table. He looked like a man who had not slept and was not going to sleep, and had accepted both of these facts without complaint. There were lines in his face that she hadn't seen on the 34th floor of Blackthorn Capital. She wasn't sure if they were new or if she was simply closer now. "He's made contact," Vescari said. "An hour ago. Indirect, through a business associate who has no idea he's being used as a channel. The message was that he's willing to negotiate a settlement, that the last 2 days have been a misunderstanding, that he wants to meet." "Don't." "I know." "If he wants to meet, it's because he needs you in a specific location at a specific time for a reason that has nothing to do with negotiation." "I know, Maren." The use of her name landed differently than it had before. Not the categorizing use that Serrano had given it. Something else. She moved past it. "The gala," she said. "The Hartwell Foundation event tomorrow night. You're listed as an attending patron. I've attended for 8 years. Missing it would signal that you're compromised and in retreat." "I know." She pulled the legal pad from her jacket. She'd been carrying it constantly, the same reflex that made her keep the encrypted drive in her inside pocket. "Serrano will know you're still operational if you appear tomorrow night. It keeps him uncertain about what you have and what you're planning. It also puts me in a room with 400 people and a target on my back? Yes. She met his eyes. But it's also the last place he can confirm whether you know about the gala's private security network. Beskari's expression sharpened. What about it? The Hartwell event uses a contracted security firm that shares a server infrastructure with a platform I found in the Corelli communication logs. I don't think it's coincidence. I think the gala's security network is where Serrano is planning to execute whatever comes next. He has access to it, or someone he's working with does, and a room with 400 witnesses and a contracted security detail is the perfect environment to construct an incident that looks like chaos rather than deliberate. The room was very quiet. He's planning to use the gala, Beskari said. I think he's planning to end this at the gala, one way or another. She looked at the legal pad. Which means I need to be inside that security network before the event begins. He looked at her for a long moment. She had learned, over the past 36 hours, to read the quality of his pauses. Not perfectly, but well enough to distinguish between the pause that meant calculation and the pause that meant something closer to concern. This one was the second kind, which was interesting. You're not an operative, he said. No. I'm the person who can crack a contracted security server in a hotel ballroom, clone the administrative access, and monitor every communication channel Serrano is using during that event in real time. She paused. You need someone in that room who can do that. I'm the only person you have. He didn't argue, which was its own kind of answer. The gala was at the Alderman Hotel on Michigan Avenue, a venue of the specific category that Chicago deployed for events where money performed its own legitimacy. Gilt ceilings, chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, a ballroom that fit 400 people in a configuration that looked generous. The Hartwell Foundation's annual charity event drew politicians, corporate executives, institutional donors, and because Chicago was Chicago, a specific tier of attendant whose business interests existed in the productive gray space between legitimate and otherwise. Maren arrived at 8:15 in a car that was not the estate's black Suburban. She was wearing a dress she did not own. It had materialized in her room Saturday afternoon with no explanation. Black, well-cut, appropriate to the venue, her size. She had stared at it for 4 minutes and then put it on because the alternative was the charcoal blazer she'd been wearing for 62 hours, and even she had limits. She had the cloning device in her bag. It was the size of a thumb drive and functionally more dangerous than anything else in the building. The hotel's contracted security used a private wireless management network to coordinate their personnel. A standard configuration for events of this scale, allowing real-time positioning of staff, communication with venue management, and interface with external feeds from 43 mounted cameras positioned across the ballroom, lobby, and 3 private event spaces on the second floor. The network operated on a closed channel but accessed the hotel's broader infrastructure through a shared authentication layer. The shared authentication layer was the door. She found a seat near a pillar 15 feet from the nearest security personnel station, a tablet-equipped podium where a contracted security coordinator was managing the floor layout, ordered a drink she didn't intend to finish, and opened the cloning device's passive scan function under the table. It took 6 minutes to find the authentication layer, 4 more to pull the credential token. The administrator had been logged in since 4 in the afternoon, which meant the token was still live, and a live token on an unsecured ambient network was, in the particular language of Maren's professional life, an open door with a welcome mat. She was inside the security network at 8:31. She began pulling communication logs in the background, running a passive monitor across all channels while she sat with her untouched drink and watched the ballroom fill. 400 people, exactly as expected. The specific social ecosystem of a Chicago charitable event. The money and the politics and the careful choreography of people who needed each other and needed to be seen needing each other. Beskari arrived at 8:45. She saw him from across the room, and the specific quality of his arrival registered on her body before her mind caught up. The way the crowd rearranged itself fractionally, the way conversation continued but attention pivoted, the baseline social electricity of a room responding to someone who carried weight. He was in a dark suit, the same controlled posture as always, and he moved through the space with the specific economy of a man who had chosen to be here and would not show that the choice was difficult. His eyes found her across the room. She gave him nothing. A half second of eye contact, then away. They had discussed this. Minimal acknowledgement, no visible operational coordination, the performance of two people who happened to be at the same event for separate reasons. She turned back to the security network feed running on her phone under the table. The logs were clean for the first hour. Standard coordination traffic, position updates, guest management, a noise complaint from the third floor that was handled in 4 minutes. She monitored it with the background attention of someone reading while listening to a radio, the content registering without requiring full focus. Then, at 9:47, a channel that had been dormant since she accessed the network opened. Not a standard security channel. A subfrequency that was using the contracted network's infrastructure, but broadcasting on a different identifier. Something planted inside the network, she realized. A ghost channel that looked like a maintenance frequency if you didn't know to look for it, but was actually a private communication line that somebody had built into the hotel's security architecture before the event began. The first transmission was 11 words. She read them twice, very fast, and the drink in front of her ceased to exist, and the 400 people in the ballroom ceased to exist, and the gilded ceiling and the chandeliers and all of it ceased to exist because the 11 words on her screen were coordinates. Ballroom east exit, northwest column, upper tier, confirmed at 2200. She looked up. Her eyes went to the upper tier of the ballroom, a mezzanine level, accessible by 2 staircases, lined with decorative columns, used for overflow seating during the event's dinner portion, but currently unoccupied, the chairs stacked, the space between the columns dark and largely unobserved from the main floor. She looked at the northwest column. The angle from the northwest column to the ballroom floor was direct, unobstructed. A line of sight that terminated at the area near the main entrance where guests of significance were conventionally positioned, where Vascari was, right now, talking to a man she didn't recognize with the controlled attention of someone managing a social interaction that required management. Her body understood before the thought completed itself. 2200 hours. 10 o'clock. She had 9 minutes. She typed 3 words into the secure channel she and Vascari had established before entering the building. Do not move. Then she stood up. She moved toward the east staircase with the deliberate pace of someone who knows that running in a crowded ballroom full of people is the fastest way to cause exactly the chaos she needed to prevent. Her heels were wrong for this. She hadn't thought about stairs when the dress materialized in her room. And she held the railing and went up fast and quiet and came off the staircase onto the mezzanine level at 9:54. The mezzanine was dim. The ambient light from the ballroom below came up in gold sheets that didn't reach the back of the space. She moved along the railing toward the northwest, past the first column, the second, counting them, hearing her own breathing in the relative quiet up here. The ballroom noise below her becoming something distant and continuous like water. She saw him at the 4th column, not Serrano. Serrano wasn't a man who did this himself. A man she didn't recognize, compact, dark jacket, positioned in the space between the column and the mezzanine railing, with the practiced stillness of someone who has done this before and has built his patience specifically for this. The patience of a man waiting for a clock to reach a number. He hadn't heard her. She was still 8 feet away and he was angled toward the ballroom, toward the sight line, and she understood in the specific, cold clarity of a moment that has no room for second thoughts, that she had approximately 4 minutes before this man did what he was here to do, and she had no weapon and no backup. And the security detail on the main floor did not know this was happening. She did the only thing she could do. She pulled up the security network on her phone and transmitted the ghost channel's coordinates to every active security terminal in the building simultaneously, tagging it as a Priority 1 alert under the emergency broadcast function she'd found in the administrative access. A function she'd noted and filed away without knowing why. The reflex of someone who cataloged tools before she needed them. Every security terminal in the Hartwell event lit up at once. The man at the column heard it. Heard the simultaneous buzz of 43 terminals firing at once. Heard something change in the quality of the room below. Heard feet moving in the lobby. And he turned. He saw her. The 8 feet between them was not a safe distance. She understood this in the specific way that the body communicates danger. Not a thought, but a pulse of cold that moved from her stomach to her throat. And she understood it a half second before he moved, which was the only reason she was already stepping backward when he came toward her, fast and low and purposeful. She hit the staircase railing with her hip, hard, and it sent a jolt up through her side that blanked her vision for 1 second, and in that second his hand closed on her arm, and the phone went over the railing and fell into the ballroom below, and she heard the impact. And then she heard screaming, and then everything happened at once. The security detail came up both staircases. She heard them before she saw them, the radio traffic that she'd generated with the emergency broadcast coordinating in real time, positions converging on the mezzanine. The man holding her arm heard it too, and made a decision. His grip tightened and then released, the calculation of a man choosing escape over objective. And he went over the far railing in a drop she didn't watch because she was gripping the near railing with both hands and breathing in a way that had nothing to do with control. Below, the ballroom had become noise and movement. She looked down through the railing and found Vescari in the chaos. The way you find a fixed point. He was still standing. He was upright. He was turning toward the staircase, and the specific quality of the way he turned told her he had read the emergency broadcast and moved away from the sightline in the second she'd bought him. Her hip was going to be a bruise the size of a dinner plate. She gripped the railing and stood up straight and did not allow herself to think about the 4 minutes that had just happened because thinking about them would cost something she needed to keep. A security coordinator appeared at the top of the staircase, saw her, said something into his radio. She said, "Northwest column. He went over the far railing. Dark jacket, 5'10", compact build. He has at least 90 seconds on you." The coordinator was already moving. She went down the staircase. The ballroom was controlled chaos. The specific management performance of security professionals handling an event disruption, moving guests toward exits with the choreographed calm that was trained rather than felt. She moved against the flow until she found Vescari, which took 40 seconds and felt like longer. He was near the east wall, flanked by 2 of his own people who had materialized from somewhere she hadn't tracked. When she reached him, he looked at her with an expression that had several layers, and she didn't have time to read all of them. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm not." "Your side." "It's a bruise. I need your phone." He gave it to her. She pulled up the security feed access. The ghost channel was still active, still broadcasting, and in the last transmission before the shooter had moved, there had been a response from the receiving end. A reply to the coordinates confirmation, 4 words, sent at 9:53. She had caught it on her phone before the phone went over the railing, photographed it in the 3 seconds between reading it and standing up, the automatic documentation reflex of a woman who had spent her career knowing that evidence disappeared if you didn't preserve it. She pulled up the photo on Vescari's phone. The 4 words in the reply transmission were, "Clean after, remove Holloway." Below the 4 words, a network identifier, the sending terminal's registration address. Standard in network logs, automatic, the kind of metadata that most people forgot was being generated. The registration address resolved, in the database she'd pulled into her access earlier that night, to a single terminal. A specific device, a specific location within the hotel's network infrastructure. The terminal was registered to the Hartwell Foundation's private event coordination office on the 2nd floor. She showed Vescari the screen. He read it again. "Someone inside the foundation," he said. "Someone inside this building tonight," she said, using the foundation's terminal, which means either a foundation employee or someone with access to a foundation employee's credentials. She looked at him. "Serrano was here," she said. "Not out there. Not at a safe distance running this from outside. He's been in this building tonight." The noise of the managed evacuation moved around them. Security personnel, guests, the controlled dismantling of an event. In the middle of it, Vescari stood absolutely still with the phone in his hand and the 4 words on the screen. "The 2nd floor office," he said. "Yes." He looked toward the east staircase. She could see him running the calculation, the time elapsed since the transmission, whether the terminal's user was still in the building, whether going up those stairs right now was walking into another trap or walking into the only opportunity they were going to get. He started moving. She followed. The 2nd floor corridor was empty, cleared by the evacuation in progress below. Their footsteps on the marble were the loudest sound on the floor. The Foundation's event coordination office was at the far end, a frosted glass door with a temporary sign on it, the light visible through the glass. Someone was still inside. Vescari stopped outside the door. His 2 people positioned themselves on either side. He looked at her and she gave him a single nod. She'd been in the security network all evening. She knew exactly what had come from inside this room, and she was prepared to say so to whoever was standing on the other side of that glass. He opened the door. The room was a standard event coordination space. Folding tables, equipment cases, a rack of radios, 2 monitors showing security feeds from the ballroom below, a half-eaten catered meal on one of the folding tables that spoke of someone who had been here for hours. Victor Serrano stood at the far monitor with his jacket on and his hands visible, and the specific expression of a man who has calculated his options in the last 40 seconds and found them limited. He looked at Maren first, then at Viscari, then back at Maren, and in that second look was something she had not seen in the assessment look from the estate office, or in the calibrated dignity under accusation performance, or in any of the subsequent architecture of his conducted war. What she saw now was the unmanaged thing, the thing underneath the 11 years of constructed loyalty and constructed competence and constructed trust, and it was not anger, and it was not fear. It was recognition, the specific recognition of a man looking at the thing that ended him and knowing it. "Dominic," Serrano said. Viscari said nothing. "I need you to understand." "Don't," Viscari said. The word was very quiet. Serrano's jaw tightened. He looked at Maren again with that recognition look, and she held it, the same way she'd held Viscari's gaze across the 34th floor 2 days ago that had felt like a different lifetime, and she did not look away. "You have 48 hours, Serrano said. He was talking to Viscari, but his eyes were on her. "The Corelli network goes fully operational Monday morning, regardless of what you do to me tonight. The infrastructure is already in place. The capital is already—" "Is it?" Maren said. He stopped. She reached into her bag, pulled out the small secondary drive she'd prepared that afternoon on the air-gapped machine, the one containing a single document, the full architecture of the new trap, time-stamped, showing account structures, routing paths, and the trigger mechanism embedded in the Corelli network's reconciliation server, along with the Luxembourg credential pathway and the legacy authentication token from the decommissioned banking platform. She set it on the folding table between them. "The capital moves at 6:45 Monday morning," she said. "Every account in the Corelli operational network, every offshore structure, every logistics holding company that's been capitalized over the past 18 months with money taken from accounts under Dominic Viscari's control." She kept her voice even, the same register she used when she was presenting a financial analysis to a room that didn't want to hear it. "It moves into 17 accounts across 9 jurisdictions. None of them have your access credentials. None of them are recoverable by any instrument you currently have." Serrano looked at the drive. "You had a shadow credential," he said. "You read everything I built." "You read everything I built the first time," she said. "I built a second one." The silence in the room had a specific texture. She was aware of Viscari to her left, of the 2 men in the doorway, of the sounds of the managed evacuation continuing below them, of her own heartbeat, which was faster than she wanted it to be and slower than it had been on the mezzanine stairs. Serrano looked from the drive to her face, and in the quality of that look she understood something she hadn't fully articulated before. He had constructed an entire parallel narrative in which she was a peripheral figure. The inside auditor, the paper trail, the convenient target for a counter-accusation. He had planned for her as an instrument, not as an opponent. He had not planned for her as the person who dismantled everything he'd spent 18 months constructing in 49 hours, on a folding table in a basement utility room with a dead man's credential and a Luxembourg account he didn't know existed. "You can't prove any of this holds up in federal court," Serrano said. The last resource of the man with no resources left. The procedural argument. The account movements, the trap, "I don't need federal court tonight," she said. "Tonight, I just need Monday morning." And then his phone, sitting on the folding table next to the half-eaten catered meal, lit up with a notification. He looked at it. She looked at it. The notification was from a banking application, an automated alert from one of the Corelli network's offshore management platforms, triggered by a scheduled security audit that ran every Saturday at 10 p.m. The audit had found an anomaly in the network's reconciliation server. A dormant element it couldn't categorize, nested inside the primary authentication layer, time-stamped from 31 hours ago. The trap, not Monday morning. Now. The security audit had found it early. which meant the Corelli Network's technical team was reading the alert right now, which meant the window she'd calculated, the gap between discovery and counter-response, the time it would take their people to analyze the anomaly and understand what it was and begin disabling it. That window the window was closing in real time. Maren understood this the way she understood financial structures under pressure. Not as abstraction, but as physical fact. A clock she could feel ticking in her chest alongside her own heartbeat. The Corelli Network's security audit had found the trap 31 hours early. Their technical team was reading the alert right now, somewhere in a server room or a back office, or a phone screen held by a man who knew what he was looking at. The analysis would take time. How much time depended on how good their people were. And she had to assume their people were good, because assuming otherwise was how you lost. She looked at Serrano's phone on the folding table. She looked at Serrano. Then she picked up the phone. He moved toward her. One step, fast, the instinct of a man reaching for his last instrument of control, and Viscari's hand came down on his shoulder and stopped him with the particular finality of a grip that wasn't asking. Serrano went still. Maren was already working. She had Serrano's phone unlocked. His passcode had been in the estate files, the kind of operational detail that got documented in 11 years of close proximity administration. And she was in his banking application, reading the alert, reading the network identifier attached to it, reading the specific language of the anomaly report. The Corelli technical team had 40 minutes to understand what they'd found. Maybe less. She needed 20. She went back to the air-gapped machine's output, which she had on a secondary device in her bag. A read-only copy of the trap architecture and the trigger mechanism, everything she'd built in the utility room on the stripped laptop. She compared the anomaly report's language against the trap's signature. The audit had found the outer shell, the dormant element nested in the reconciliation server, but it had not yet resolved the trigger mechanism itself. It had flagged an unknown process, not identified a transfer protocol, which meant the technical team was still in the analysis phase, which meant the trigger was still live. She looked up. "I need 2 minutes, and I need no one to touch anything," she said to the room. Viscari looked at her, then at the men in the doorway. Then he said, 2 minutes. She sat down at the folding table in front of the event coordination monitors and connected Serrano's phone to the hotel's security network. She still had administrative access, the session was still live, and used the network pathway as a bridge to reach the Corelli platform the banking alert had originated from. It was a lateral approach, technically ugly, the kind of thing she would have spent 3 hours doing cleanly in a controlled environment. She had 2 minutes. She didn't need clean. She needed fast. The bridge connected. She was inside the Corelli platform's alert management system, not their financial infrastructure, not the reconciliation server, but the layer above it, the monitoring layer that generated alerts and dispatched them to personnel. She found the anomaly alert. It had been dispatched to 4 recipients. 2 had opened it. One had forwarded it with a note that read, "In the truncated preview visible in the dispatch log, pulling Vasquez to look at this, give us..." She closed the alert. All instances. Recalled it from all 4 recipients. Marked as resolved, automatic system closure. A function that existed in monitoring platforms for exactly this purpose, the housekeeping of false positive alerts, and she used it now for the specific purpose of buying herself the time it would take Serrano's network to notice that an alert they'd received had disappeared and then reinvestigate why. That would cost them another 20 minutes on top of the 40. She stood up. "It's done," she said. "The alert is suppressed. The trap is still live. It fires at 6:45 Monday morning when their reconciliation sweep runs. And by the time they re-identify the anomaly and understand what it is, the sweep will have already activated it." The room absorbed this. Serrano was looking at her with an expression that had moved through several stages in the last 4 minutes and had arrived at something she didn't have a precise word for. Not defeat, exactly. More like the specific exhaustion of a man watching the last piece of his architecture dismantle itself in real time, watching it happen at the hands of someone he had categorized as peripheral and now understood, too late, had never been peripheral at all. "You can't do this," he said. Not a threat. A statement of a man trying to locate the remaining factual ground. "It's already done," she said. She set his phone on the folding table. "The documentation of your communication with the Corelli network is packaged and transmitted to federal financial crimes investigators. The beneficial ownership records for TCV Holdings and its connection to Drummond Holdings Advisory Group are in the same package. The Cayman account with my name on it is documented as a construction. The creation timestamps, the IP addresses used to register it, all of it traces back to access logs from your estate office on days I wasn't in the country. He looked at her. "You weren't in the country 3 weeks ago," she said. "I was in Milwaukee for a client review. The account was built on a Tuesday afternoon while I was presenting to a room of 12 people. The timestamp conflict is documented." The thing in Serrano's expression shifted one more time, and what was underneath it, finally, was just a man. Not the architect of an 18-month conspiracy, not the decade-proven second-in-command, just a man who had made a calculation about how the world worked and how much he could extract from it, and had been wrong about the most important variable. He looked at Vescari. Vescari looked back at him. The quality of that look was the most private thing Maren had witnessed in this entire sequence of events, and she moved her eyes away from it because some things belong to the people they pass between. Vescari's men took Serrano out of the room. The door closed. The coordination office was very quiet. Below, the sounds of the managed evacuation had settled into the lower register administrative noise of an event being formally wound down, security personnel checking corridors, hotel staff beginning the work of restoration. Maren sat down in the chair in front of the monitors. Not because she chose to, because her legs made the decision without consulting her and the chair was there and she let it happen. Her side, where she'd hit the mezzanine railing, was a sustained pulse of pain that she'd been managing through operational focus, and that was now, with the operational focus released, making itself known with considerable interest. She sat with it. Vescari sat in the chair across from her. The same configuration as the office at the estate, the same quality of two people on opposite sides of a desk, with the furniture of formality between them, except neither of them was performing anything right now, and that changed the quality of the space. He looked at her for a long time without saying anything. "You suppressed the alert in 2 minutes," he said finally. "Minute 47, she said. "I had 13 seconds. He looked at the folding table. At the catered meal nobody had finished, and Serrano's phone and the small secondary drive she'd placed there and not picked back up. "Is it really over?" he said. Not rhetorically. An actual question, the kind that a man asks when he's been running on threat response for 72 hours and doesn't trust his own read on the room. "The financial infrastructure collapses Monday morning," she said. "The federal package creates a legal exposure for Corelli's network principles that takes them off the operational table for a minimum of 3 years, probably longer if the case gets built properly. Serrano is the cooperative witness they need to build it properly. And he will cooperate because the alternative is a federal conspiracy charge with a financial terrorism enhancement that carries a mandatory minimum he won't survive to finish." Vescari listened to this. "You already negotiated his cooperation," he said. "I outlined the terms in the federal package. He has 72 hours to accept, or the package stands without his cooperation, and he faces the full exposure alone." A pause. "When did you do that?" "This afternoon, while I was building the secondary trap." He looked at her with the full attention look she'd learned to receive without flinching. "You were running 4 things simultaneously." "I was running the things that needed running." He leaned forward, elbows on the folding table, and pressed his hands together in front of his face in the posture of a man who is very tired and is allowing himself, in this room with this person, to show it. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The Cayman account. The one with your name on it." "Yes." $4.3 million. He looked at her. "It's still there. The documentation I'm sending federal investigators establishes it as a construction, but the account itself, the capital inside it, that's not addressed in any of the legal packaging." She understood what he was asking. She hadn't expected it to be asked this directly, and she appreciated the directness in the way she appreciated all direct things. "It goes back into your accounts," she said. "All of it. I'm not a thief." "It wouldn't be theft. It was built in your name. It exists in your name. The legal framework for it goes back," she said. "That's not a negotiation." He looked at her for a long moment. The tiredness in his face didn't resolve, but something else moved through it. Something she was getting better at reading and still didn't have an exact name for. "All right," he said. They sat in the quiet coordination office while the Hartwell Hotel sorted itself out below them, and neither of them spoke for a while, and that was all right too. The drive back to the estate took 40 minutes through a city that was doing what cities do at midnight on a Saturday. Moving, indifferent, enormous, its own weather system of lives and commerce, and the particular low-frequency hum of a place too large to ever fully sleep. Maren sat in the back of the car and watched it go past and felt the specific quality of an exhaustion that had moved beyond the physical into something structural, something in the load-bearing parts of her. She had not been home in 3 days. Home was a second-floor apartment in Wicker Park with a second-hand couch and a kitchen table where she did her best work and a window that faced a courtyard that got good light in the mornings. She had left it on a Wednesday at 6:40 in the morning to drive to a desk under a flickering light, and she had not been back. She thought about the apartment the way you think about something that belongs to a previous version of yourself. Not with longing, exactly. With a kind of wondering recognition. At the estate, she went to the room that had been hers for 3 days and sat on the edge of the bed and took off the dress she didn't own and put back on the clothes she did, and that felt, obscurely, like the right thing to do. She found the legal pad in her bag and set it on the bedside table. Looked at it. She had filled 14 pages. The architecture of a crisis, documented in pencil, starting with a number in column G and ending in a hotel coordination office with a suppressed alert and a man's phone on a folding table. She closed her eyes. She slept for 11 hours without dreaming about numbers, which was new. Monday morning came in gray and cold over the lake, the particular gray of late winter in Chicago that isn't quite ready to commit to anything else. Maren was at the desk in the second-floor office. Vescari's desk, her desk, for the past 3 days, the distinction having blurred in a way she was aware of but wasn't examining. With coffee and the laptop and the Luxembourg account monitoring dashboard open at 6:30 in the morning. 15 minutes. She had not told anyone the exact trigger time beyond Vescari, who was in the room with her, sitting in the visitor's chair with his own coffee, reading something on his phone with the appearance of a man who was either very calm or very good at performing calm. She suspected at this point that with him the difference was academic. 6:41. She watched the dashboard. The reconciliation sweep was automated. It didn't require a human to initiate it. It simply ran, as it had run every Monday morning for however long the Corelli network had been using this platform. Because automated systems were reliable, and reliable systems were trusted, and trusted systems were exactly where you put things you needed to survive discovery. 6:44. She set her coffee down. 6:45. The sweep fired. She watched it happen in the monitoring data, the automated process touching each of the 43 subsidiary accounts in sequence, running its verification protocol, hitting the reconciliation server where the trigger lived, nested inside the authentication layer, dormant and invisible until the sweep's own credential activated it, and then the trigger fired, and the transfer protocol launched, and the first movement of capital registered on the Luxembourg dashboard as an incoming transfer from a Cayman account, $47 million, arriving in a holding structure that Serrano had never seen, and the Corelli network had no record of. Then the second, then the third. 11 transfers in 8 minutes. Sequential, under threshold, individually, collectively, catastrophic to the financial infrastructure of an organization that had been building toward operational deployment for 18 months and was now watching that infrastructure drain into accounts it couldn't touch. $109 million, not the 112 she'd projected. $3 million had already been moved by the Corelli network's own people in the hours after the suppressed alert. A defensive action taken on incomplete information that had pulled capital out of the accounts she was targeting and into structures she didn't have access to. $3 million lost. $109 million recovered. She sat back. Vescari was looking at her. "It worked," she said. Not triumphant. Factual. "Yes," he said. At 8:15, the first federal notification arrived, an automated alert generated by the financial crimes package she'd transmitted Saturday, triggered by the detection of the large-scale account movements she'd told the investigators to watch for as confirmation of the trap's activation. The package was now an active case. The investigators had what they needed to begin the legal process of seizing the transferred capital as criminal proceeds and building the case against the Corelli network's principals. Serrano's 72-hour window to cooperate had 38 hours left. He called his lawyer at 8:40. His lawyer called the federal investigators at 9. Maren learned this from Vescari, who had sources she didn't ask him to identify, and she absorbed the information with the flat satisfaction of a structure performing as designed. Then she asked for her car. Vescari looked at her. "Where are you going?" "Home." He was quiet for a moment. "We haven't talked about—" "I know." She stood up, picked up her bag. The legal pad went in last, on top. "I'm going home. I'm going to sleep in my own bed. I'm going to sit at my own kitchen table. And then I'm going to think about what comes next." He stood too. The room between them had the particular quality of a space that has contained a significant amount of shared experience in a short time, and both of them were aware of it, and neither of them said that part out loud. "What has come next?" he said. She looked at him. "The legitimate conversion. You said it yourself. The violence ends, the infrastructure remains. But the infrastructure has to be rebuilt on a different foundation. Financial, legal, structural. Every entity, every account, every holding company." She paused. "That's years of work." "Yes. You'd need someone who knows the existing structure inside out and can rebuild it in a form that sustains legal scrutiny." "Yes," he said again. She looked at the desk, at the maps on the drafting table with their cramped handwritten annotations, the cracked spine forensic accounting book, the 2 monitors and the window full of lake and gray sky. She had spent 3 days in this room, and it felt, in some structural way, more like a working space than any desk she'd occupied in 4 years at Blackthorn Capital. "Call me in a week," she said. Something moved in his face that completed itself this time rather than stopping short. Not quite what she'd call a smile. Closer to it than anything she'd seen in 3 days. "A week," he said. She left the estate in the gray morning, down the private lane between the old oaks, through the gate that opened before the car slowed, and onto Lakeshore Drive, where the city opened up around her in its enormous, indifferent continuity. She sat in the back seat and felt the particular weight of a person who has come through something and is still in the first hours of knowing they've come through it, when the coming through is real, but not yet integrated. When you're still carrying the adrenaline architecture of the past 72 hours, and the ordinary world looks strange through it, its textures too normal, its scale somehow both larger and smaller than you remembered. Her phone had 37 notifications. She looked at them without opening them. Several were from numbers she didn't recognize, journalists, she guessed, or people from Blackthorn Capital who had heard about the federal action and wanted to have conversations she was not prepared to have. One was from a name she did recognize, a former colleague from a firm she'd worked at before Blackthorn, a forensic accountant she respected who had texted at 7 this morning. "Maren, heard your name on a federal press notification. You okay?" She typed back, "Yes. Long story. Coffee sometime." She put the phone away. The apartment in Wicker Park was exactly as she'd left it. The kitchen table with the ring from Wednesday morning's coffee cup she hadn't wiped up. The second-hand couch. The window with its courtyard light. The cold that came in at the edges of the old windows. The specific cold of a building that had been standing since before insulation standards. A presence rather than an absence. She put her bag down by the door. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at it. Just looked at it. The ordinary domestic reality of a space that was hers, that no one had built a shadow credential into, that no one was monitoring, where the lighting didn't flicker, and the only work she'd been assigned to do was the work of living in it. She sat at the kitchen table. The legal pad came out of her bag one more time. She set it in front of her and looked at the 14 pages of penciled architecture, the column G number, the TCV holding structure, the Malta registration, the hand-drawn diagrams that had started everything on a Wednesday morning when she couldn't sleep. She turned to a clean page, not to work, just to have the clean page there, the way you open a door to a room you're not going into yet, but want to know is accessible. The habit of a person for whom the blank page was not intimidating but orienting, a surface that acknowledged that what came next hadn't been written yet. She made coffee, actual coffee, from the bag of beans she kept in the freezer, ground and brewed in the small machine on her counter that she'd owned for 6 years and maintained with the same methodical care she applied to everything she valued. She drank it at the kitchen table while the city morning went on outside her window. At 11, she called the lawyer Vescari had connected her with Saturday night, a woman named Dara Chen, who worked out of a firm on the 41st floor of a building on Randolph Street, and who had, over 2 phone calls in the past 48 hours, demonstrated the specific quality of intelligence that Maren recognized and respected. The call was brief and functional. The federal case documentation was solid. The Cayman account counter-narrative was airtight. There was nothing that required her presence or her testimony in the immediate term, and Dara would be in contact if that changed. At 1 in the afternoon, she received a notification from the Luxembourg account management platform. The federal seizure order had processed, and the $109 million in transferred capital had been frozen pending adjudication of the criminal case, which meant it was out of the Corelli network's reach permanently, which meant the infrastructure was gone. She looked at the notification for a long moment, then she closed the app. She thought about Carter Drummond, who had run for a service elevator with a dead phone battery and $46 million he would never touch. She thought about Randall Fitch, who was presumably managing the reputational consequences of his firm's connection to a federal financial crimes case with the same practiced patrician performance he applied to everything. She thought about the young man with the improvised bandage on his arm, whether he'd seen a doctor, whether the arm was all right. She thought about a man named Karev, who had not been alive when she left this apartment on Wednesday morning, and had never been alive to her before that morning either, and was still not alive now, and that fact sat somewhere in her chest with a specific weight she didn't try to resolve. She thought about 11 years, the duration of a trust that had been built and hollowed and used as a weapon, the specific patience of a betrayal that long. She didn't feel sorry for herself. Feeling sorry for yourself was the luxury of someone who hadn't chosen to be in this situation, and she had chosen, specifically, at the edge of the 34th floor with Vescari in front of her and the elevator behind her and the rain coming down on South Wacker Drive. She had chosen with clear information about what the choice entailed, or as much information as she'd had access to at that moment, which was more than most people had when they chose. She had no regrets about the choosing. She had questions about what she was now, not existential questions, not the kind that required resolution before forward motion. Practical ones. The kind you answer by what you do next. She was not an auditor anymore, in the way she had been an auditor. That word described a function within a system she'd been invisible in, and she was not that person in that system anymore. She was the person who had walked across the 34th floor and gotten in the car, who had built a trap on a folding table in a utility room with 13 seconds to spare, who had stood on a mezzanine staircase in a dress she didn't own and made a decision that the situation required making. She was the person Viscari would call in a week. She opened the legal pad to the clean page. She wrote 2 words at the top. What's next? Not a question. A heading. She began to write. Outside the window, the courtyard was getting the afternoon light now, the gray burning off enough to let something warmer through. The specific quality of late winter light that is not yet spring but carries in it the structural argument for spring. The longer day, the lower angle, the suggestion of a season that hasn't arrived but is no longer entirely theoretical. Maren Holloway sat at her kitchen table and wrote, and the city went on around her in its enormous ongoing way, and the lake moved under the gray and the gold, and the numbers in her mind arranged themselves into new patterns, and for the first time in longer than she could immediately account for, the space she occupied felt exactly the right size. Not too small, not invisible. Exactly the right size. She picked up her coffee, drank it while it was still warm for once, and kept writing.